At this time, I'd like to ask Sam Howard to take the podium and introduce our guest speaker today. Sam is Chairman, President, and CEO of Phoenix Holdings and the Chair of the Chamber's Education 2020 Leadership Council. Sam, thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and it's good to see such a large group here this afternoon. We want to inform you about the critical issues facing education, and we try to do that through this Education 2020 Speaker Series. But what really matters is academic performance. What is the academic performance of our public school students? What does it mean? We know that Tennessee standards have been the lowest in the country, but they have recently been raised by the governor, and that's a good thing. We have to keep them up, though. We also know that our graduates will compete for jobs globally. They'll not compete for jobs simply here in Tennessee. And we also hear stories and reports about how American students are being outperformed by students from other countries. We have someone with us today who can help us to answer these questions and gives us a global perspective of this issue. Tom Loveless is a senior fellow in governance at Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. Dr. Loveless represents the United States at the General Assembly of the International Association for the Evaluation of Educational Attainment. This is a group of 60 nations that governs international testing, and he served also on the President's National Mathematics Advisory Panel. He is with us today to discuss how are public students really performing, a global perspective of education standards and accountability. Please join me in welcoming Tom to Nashville.
I'm going to be talking about testing today, and I hope to inform you about where the United States stands in terms of international testing. I'm going to explain some of the tests and what they do. I'm even going to show you some sample problems, but I brought the answers too. They're going to be up there. Now, why should we care? Here's a study that Rick Hanishek, who's an economist at Stanford, along with some colleagues, did. And what they did is they took about 40 years of international test data and they plotted nations, and you see the United States on the two graphs, and they wanted to answer the question, what matters in terms of economic growth? Is it that you put kids through more years of school, or is it that the kids learn more by going to school? So is it seat time and degree building, or is it knowledge in terms of test scores? The one on the left tests the proposition that it's knowledge. And you see that sloping line, meaning that countries that improved in test scores over this 40-year period of time also had increases in GDP. Okay, so economically, the countries that, if you go back to 1960, the first international test was given in the early 1960s, put together by a number of psychometricians. The countries that have gained over the last 40 or 50 years, a really good example of that is South Korea. In the 60s, a poor nation, so poverty has nothing to do with this, a very poor nation, but over 40 years has dramatically increased its achievement in math and science, and its GDP has gone up at the same time. On the right is testing the proposition. You see there's very little effect. That flat line means there's no real heavy correlation between the years of education that a nation gives its kids and economic growth. So in terms of correlation, and of course, a correlation is not causality. We don't know for a fact that it was the increase in test scores that drove this, but we do know that countries that increased their test scores over 40 years had a corresponding increase in gross domestic product. Now, there are two tests, as I said, the PISA and the Temps, and so this may be difficult for you to read in the back, but they differ quite a bit. Okay, the PISA is really a high school test, and it's given to an age-based sample of 15-year-olds. So in the US, it's given in the fall of the sophomore year, typically. About 2/3 of the kids in their sophomore year, but they're scattered across grades. What they share in common is they're all 15 years old. About 60-something nations participate in PISA. It's pretty new. The first PISA test was in 2000. The Temps test, this is more famous here in the United States. When the results come out, they usually make their front page. It's grade-based, so the samples are 4th graders and 8th graders. And the Temps was first given in 1995, but it's the test that I serve on the international body that governs it. It's the test that has its roots really back in the early 1960s. So the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and beyond. Again, grade-based sample, 4th and 8th grade. By the way, one of the myths about international testing, I hear this a lot from people, and I'll answer the question now before someone poses it, is people think, well, don't these other countries like Japan, don't they cherry pick the kids who take the test? So like only the really high achieving kids in those countries take the test? In other words, they're asking, isn't this test loaded? Aren't the dice loaded? The answer is no, they are not. The body that governs it really polices how the test is given, how the sample is given, how the sample is drawn, and how the test is given. So it may have been true, I think, on the first administration in the 60s, that there was some game playing with the test. That no longer happens. And there was a test given in the 90s of high school kids called the end of secondary school test. And then what happened was the samples truly weren't comparable from nation to nation, because some countries, the Scandinavian countries, for example, their equivalent of the end of secondary school is really almost like college. So when you compare those across countries, you're not getting a good comparison. However, 4th graders and 8th graders are pretty much the same around the world. So it truly is a decent comparison to make. Now the philosophy of the two assessments is quite different. PISA is really a constructivist-oriented test. It measures the ability to apply what has been learned to real-world situations. So it's looking at problem-solving primarily. I'm on the PISA board for the United States, and I was put on there for one reason, because I'm a critic of PISA. So it was nice that they brought their critics in. But the PISA test, my criticism of, for instance, the math test, is that it's not terribly mathematical. The Temps test measures what has been learned in the school curriculum. So it actually, that test was put together by bringing the 63 nations that take part in Temps together, and for each of those nations to say, here's what we teach in 4th grade math, here's what we teach in 8th grade math, and then finding the common ingredients that all 63 countries teach, and then testing on those items. So it's constructed differently. The scope then of learning is different, the content is different. You can tell by the PISA content domains, they sound different. The content, if you look at the titles, mathematical literacy, and what is mathematical literacy? The content domains within that phrase are space and shape, change in relationships, quantity, and uncertainty. Now, you know, as a teacher, if I told a parent, your kid is doing really well in space and shape, but not so good in uncertainty, they would look at me with a blank face, like a, you know, it's like a Star Trek movie. Compare it to the Temps domains: number, geometric shapes and measures, data display. That's 4th grade. And at 8th grade, number, which means arithmetic. It's the newer phrase for it. Algebra, geometry, and needed chance, needed probability. And then here's the content: science. PISA makes lots of policy recommendations. Temps is mostly a data gathering tool, and you don't see a lot of policy recommendations made by the Temps people. Now let's take a look at a couple of items so you get a better idea. This is from Temps, 4th grade. And you can see it's a subtraction problem, but it is presented in a problem-solving context. Mano did the subtraction problem above for homework, but spilled some of his drink on it. So you see the digit there that is missing? It's 942 minus 500 something 7. The middle digit's missing in the tens position. And the answer is 415. One digit could not be read. His answer of 415 was correct. What is the missing digit? So this is a kind of clever way of assessing subtraction skills. Any 4th grader should know how to subtract whole numbers with 3 digits. You have to borrow, in this case, from the 10 spot. you know, so 2 minus 7, and then you draw a line through the 4, and that kind of thing, if you did it back when I was going to school. Another way that a clever student would solve this is to take the 942 and subtract 415. And you get the answer, and then you look at the tens digit and you see that it was 2. There's how the countries across the world, around the world, did on this particular item. You see Chinese Taipei, which is very high in most of the international sampling. Over 80% of the kids got it right. Hong Kong, Singapore. Those 3 Asian countries dominate math and science. And I don't mean that they're like at the top. There's a big space between the top achievers in math and science and the second tier nations. The US is actually in the second tier. I'm going to show you that in a little bit. But Russian Federation, Kazakhstan has a little number there by it. They violated actually the sampling rules, and so they have asterisks by everything in terms of their score. Kazakhstan's new to the testing community. So. You know, it's an interesting issue though. They have about 1/3 of their students are Russian speaking, and they didn't sample them. They didn't show up in the proportion that they should have in their samples, so they were essentially, you know, asterisked the rest of the way. Japan, Lithuania. You can see the international average. The US scores just a little below. 41% of our 4th graders got that item right. Now here, to show you the difference between Temps and PISA, here's a PISA item. And I don't like this item, gotta tell you right off the bat. This is for 15-year-olds, because it's, in fairness to PISA, the PISA items essentially to me are quantitative puzzles. They're measuring something, and they're measuring, you know, are kids clever with numbers, but the actual underlying mathematics is not horribly rigorous. So take a look at this. For a rock concert, a rectangular field of size 100 meters by 50 meters, see the European influence, this is a very European test, was reserved for the audience. The concert was completely sold out, and the field was full with all the fans standing. Which one of the following is likely to be the best estimate of the total number of people attending the concert? Now, in order to do this, you first find the square meters, right, of the field. So it's 100 times 50, which is 5,000 square meters. And then you have to ask yourself, how many kids can stand in a square meter? How many 15-year-olds? Now, a square meter, now I was on the plane doing this, not on this trip, another trip. And I figured 3 people per square meter. I like to have a little space, and I've been to a lot of rock concerts, but I like to have a little space. Well, 3 times 5,000 is 15,000, and that's not one of the possible choices. And then I thought, well, and you also need room for the stage, and you need aisles, and you've got fire marshals, and you've got... So then I got down to maybe 10, and so I guessed 20, and that happens to be the right answer. So C is the right answer. And you notice the European notation, there's no comma. So one of my complaints about this item is the actual mathematics, although estimation I think is an important skill, the actual math here is multiplying whole numbers. That's the math. And kids learn that by the end of 3rd grade, even 5,000 times 4. And then I think some kids are going to be thrown by the notation, no commas, and also the use of meters. You know, if you don't really know what a meter is. So that's what a PISA item looks like. And by the way, PISA items are kind of hip like that. They have questions about the internet, rock concerts, stuff that 15-year-olds would like. All right, now, the rest of the way, anytime I show you some graphs, I'm going to try to tell you about where Tennessee is in Davidson County. Here's where I got all that, okay? So here's 4th grade NAEP. Now, these scores were just released a month ago. So the NAEP is our national test, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And all the states take it. And there's the national average, 240, that's the red bar, right? The top 5 states I've shown there in white, and the bottom 5 at the bottom. And then I've got Tennessee in green, and I've got Davidson County in lighter green down here. Now, how did I come up with this? Tennessee actually takes the NAEP, so that's a real score, 232. But what I'm going to do the rest of the time on Temps since I know when I get to the international test, which Tennessee has not taken, well, when I get to that, I know the U.S. score, right? And I know from here where Tennessee scores relative to the U.S. average, so I'm going to put that on that scale. That's going to be the strategy. It gives us a ballpark estimate. It's not perfect. We don't want to, write laws based on this, but it works. Then the second thing I did was I looked at Davidson County's scores. They're producing normal curve equivalent scores, which is like a percentile. And from that, I can do the same thing. If I know Tennessee's score, I know Davidson County scores below the Tennessee average, I can extrapolate and then kind of estimate where the Davidson County score is. So the bottom line here is if Davidson County took NACC, and by the way, there is a NACC test that it could take all by itself. It's called a TUDA. It's the Trial and Urban District Assessment. And there are about 20 cities that take it. Those data are going to be released next week. So cities that really do want to know, New York takes it, Chicago takes it, DC takes it, lots of cities take it, including smaller cities too. They can actually take NACC and then get a precise reading. But my estimate is Davidson County would be, and this is the bad news part, between Mississippi and DC in terms of scores, right at the bottom, one notch up. And however, one cautionary note, notice Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, those are all within a couple of points. There is noise in any test, so we can't say for certain, but, Davidson County may be up clear to Louisiana, but that's still not that great. We're talking about the bottom of the scale. Tennessee's below the national average. Here's 8th grade, the same thing. I've gotten rid of all the other states now, but here's Tennessee, also below the national average, and Davidson County, once you do all the computation, comes out about the same between Mississippi and DC, so both 4th and 8th grade. And we'll consider this in a little bit looking at international tests. So let's get to the international data. This is Tim's data. Any questions at this point? Okay. Here's the last Tim's data. This is 2007, grade 4. Now, what I've done here is taken into account that noise I talked about. Okay, so the nations are listed in order, but instead of looking at the rankings, I want you to look at the shading. So see where the U.S. is in white? And the capital letters is for 529. The countries that are also in the white grouping with it, we can't say that any of them outscored the other. They all basically have the same score, even though it's not exactly the same score. But in terms of all that noise in the test, we can say those countries scored about the same. The countries above it in the dark blue, we can say confidently outscored the United States. Okay? And it's not that many countries, but there they are. I've pulled them out now. Hong Kong, Singapore, Chinese Taipei, and by the way, some of these are not really countries. I'm going to call them all countries. Hong Kong's not a country, but there's a political thing to this. Negotiating. We were at one meeting where Chinese Taipei had the Chinese flag, and the People's Republic of China do not recognize Chinese Taipei as a separate country, right? They claim to it. So we all had to take our flags down. All the nations. So, otherwise, the People's Republic of China would have walked out. So, little incidents like that are interesting. There's Kazakhstan, and I forgot to put the asterisk, but imagine that it's there. The Russian Federation, England, and Latvia. So those are the highest scoring countries. England, by the way, has been coming up quite a bit over the last decade. So they're not just Asian countries, but you can see how much. See the ones at the top, Hong Kong, Singapore, Chinese Taipei, Japan, they really do outscore this middle band. They really do. And here are the countries below the United States. There are lots of them. The one takeaway I would take from this, the one message that I have from this, is when people say the United States scores at the bottom of the world, it is fundamentally false. We do not score at the bottom of the world. That's an exaggeration. And I'm not one to say we should have a parade celebrating our score, but we do not score at the bottom of the world. In fact, we score in the second tier. That's 4th grade. Let's look at 8th grade. Different countries now take it. But you see again these same countries coming to the top: Chinese Taipei, Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Japan. U.S. does better on the 8th grade test. Those are the only 5 countries that statistically outscore the United States at a statistically significant level. Only 5. So when you read the newspaper, the United States ranks 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, that's true, but we can't statistically distinguish the scores of the ones in 8th place, 7th place, and 6th place from the U.S. So really, there are only 5 countries we can confidently say outscore the U.S. We can confidently say that all these in the lighter blue at the bottom score below the U.S. So the scores aren't as bad as you think on Temps. Now, here's a political kind of thing you'll notice happens. If you hear national speakers trying to portray the U.S. as doing well in education, in math, they use Temps data. PISA, we score down towards the bottom. If you want to portray the United States as doing very poorly, especially if you want to get people worked up, it's a crisis in education, they're going to use PISA data. Now let's look at some trends in the Temps test. Here's 4th grade. This is 95 to 2007, so you can see the change over time. No change at all from 1995 to 2003, so an 8-year period there. There was no change in 4th grade scores. And then a pretty good pop after 2003, from 2003 to 2007. There were leaders in Washington who were trying to say this had to do with federal policy, but that's very doubtful. There are just too many things going on in education to single out one law and say, here's what did it. There are an awful lot of things going on. We have 15,000 school districts. They each are reforming and trying different things and adopting textbooks and throwing them out and hiring teachers. And so it's hard to put your finger on one thing that's going on at the same time and say, causally, do these data show that this law is, I'm talking about No Child Left Behind now, is this law working or not? Frankly, we can't make a conclusion like that based on these data. It'll give us an indicator and a correlation, but that's all. So there was a growth from 2003 to 07. Here are the by country breakouts now, the growth. So the top growing countries, right? Who had the largest gains? They were England, Hong Kong, Slovenia, and Latvia. And those 4 are statistically, they gain more than the U.S. There's a lot of noise in this particular statistic. You can see Australia, Iran, U.S., Singapore, Scotland, wide array of nations. And this is at 4th grade. Now, a perfect example of what I just mentioned about how, political people sometimes will cook the books, not cook the books, but to use selective data. If No Child Left Behind really affected 4th grade, there's no reason why it wouldn't affect 8th grade. But the big pop in 8th grade was from 95 to 99, and that predates No Child Left Behind. So it's just tough to make a case based on Temps data, or on NACC data. But you do see some steady growth here at the 8th grade, from 502 to 504 in 2003, and then to 508 in 2007. So the United States is scoring pretty well on Temps. We're not at the top. But we never had that at the top. That was foolishness on the part of Americans to think that we were. In that very first test I told you about in the early 60s, you know where we scored? About in the middle, a little above. About where we are today. No, not sky high. About where we are today. Now, here's 8th grade. And again, this is the gains by country. 2 countries that outgained the U.S. at a statistically significant level, Colombia and Lithuania, of all places. Colombia is coming off a very low base, 332. The mean of this test, the international average, is 500. So Colombia's really down there. But they gained a lot. From 95 to 2007, they gained 47 points. Lithuania had solid gains. There's Korea. Korea's already at the top and still gaining more. There's the United States. So out of the world, in 8th grade, we had the 4th largest gains. and only 2 countries really statistically had larger gains. So here, anyway, here, back to our science. These are the science scores. You see very similar kind of phenomenon here. Similar countries, too, at the top, the middle band. Here's 8th grade. Singapore, Chinese Taipei, Japan, Korea, and there's England again. England really has made some vast improvement. In terms of Europe, England has been improving. Norway has been falling off a cliff. It's very interesting. Norway and Sweden to a certain extent, but Norway really has fallen off a cliff. Now, Norway has a complaint with Temps. Norway starts their kids younger in school. So the 4th grade, they have the youngest average age of any of the nations. I believe it's 9 years old. Our 4th graders average 10 years old. So Norway's complaint is our kids are more mature. They've had equal amounts of schooling, but they're just younger kids. And there's something to be said for that, although Temps has given them opportunities to sample the next grade or the previous grade or only 10-year-olds, and the data look pretty much the same. They're still falling off a cliff. The cliff isn't quite as steep. Here's the science 4th grade gains, and as I told you, no gains, actually going down since 1995. They're not quite as stable. I'm going to show you something in just a second. They're not quite as flat as this particular indicator looks. But, a drop of 6 points from 95 to 03, and then a gain from 03 to 2007. But over the entire period, actually a fall in scores. And here's 8th grade. You see a big bump between 99 and 2003, and then a 7-point drop. So there are fluctuations in the science scores in Temps. The 8th grade scores are more encouraging for the United States than 4th grade. But here's the phenomenon that interests me in the science scores. There is more movement at different places in the distribution of kids, okay? So the top line, those are our 90th percentile kids. These are our highest achievers, top 10% of the country in science. That's where scores are falling. That's where they're really falling. The bottom kids have been going up. This is 4th grade. Remember the 4th grade scores, how that was pretty flat and actually declining? It's all due to the decline at the top end. The kids at the 10th percentile, our bottom 10% of students, showed a 7-point gain from 95 to 03 and then a 1-point gain after that. So their scores actually have been rising. So we're seeing this. I'm writing a paper right now on NAEP scores, and I see the same thing. There's this phenomenon since about either 1998 or 1999 of the bottom rising and the top kids, they're not going down. They're rising, but they're not rising any faster than they're sort of puttering along, right? But there's been really sharp growth in the bottom. Now, I do have a theory, and I am speculating, but I do think it is our accountability systems that are driving that phenomenon, mainly because they were designed to work that way. So if you take all the state accountability systems, there were 30 states that had accountability before No Child Left Behind. If you look at all of them, and if you look at No Child Left Behind, all the rewards are stacked towards raising the bottom. You get nothing. There's no incentive for moving scores at the top at all. So what this just says to me is, well, those were the objectives of the laws. The laws were passed then, so it kind of looks like, you know, the laws are having their intended effect. The incentives are working the way you'd expect them to. Schools are sanctioned under No Child Left Behind if they don't continually increase kids, getting them over the proficiency bar, right? So that's a pretty low bar. It's moving those kids at the bottom. But they get nothing for getting kids over the advanced bar, which is a very high bar. Nothing. There's no incentive for that.
So are you saying then that we're really aiming at the lowest common denominator?
No. I'm saying that if you engineer a system with incentives that encourages growth at the bottom, there's going to be growth. If there's growth, there will be growth at the bottom. It's a system. I'm not saying the top kids are being hurt. Their scores aren't going down. There's no sort of, I wrote an op-ed on this in the Wall Street, or no, the New York Times. And it's not that the top kids are going down. They're not. It's sort of a system of benign neglect. They're ignored by No Child Left Behind.
Well, that doesn't seem to be a very productive way to educate our kids. And if what you were talking about at the beginning was education results, test results being related to GDP, it would seem to me that we need to have something that's stimulating the upper part of this as much as we have something that's not just stimulating the bottom and bringing them up. That's great, that's laudable, but do we need something then to stimulate the growth in the kids who have more potential so that we can maybe help our country better that way?
Yeah, well, that's exactly what I wrote in the op-ed that we should be doing. That we.
Well, you wrote very well.
Yeah. When we agree, it's wonderful. And my argument actually was twofold. One is, every parent sends his or her child to go to school, including parents of 90th percentile children. And we have an obligation to teach them as much as we can. So it's not that we're harming them, but like I said, we're ignoring them. Then the second argument had to do with No Child Left Behind itself, which I think has decent objectives, but has become just a very tarnished brand name. If you speak to educators about No Child Left Behind, they'll tar and feather you. They just really hate it. Teachers and school principals hate No Child Left Behind. And I believe one of the reasons why they do is it's all punitive. It's all carrots. It's all sticks, no carrots, right? So schools are never rewarded for doing anything. They just simply escape punishment if they do the right thing. Right? So it's all punishment. And so my suggestion was, look, with our 90th percentile kids, including our subgroups, No Child Left Behind singles out black kids, Hispanic kids, and disadvantaged poor kids from poor households. What if we rewarded schools for boosting those kids? And I even did a study where I identified thousands upon thousands upon thousands, tens of thousands of 90th percentile black kids, Hispanic kids, and poor children. There's no incentive under No Child Left Behind to raise their scores because they're already at the top. So why not give rewards to schools for boosting their achievement? This could be a way to reauthorize No Child Left Behind in such a way that it also does some things to reward educators for doing a good job and for moving the distribution across the distribution up. Let's look at 8th grade. Same kind of phenomenon. Rose at the bottom, big leap after 1999. That's just really a huge leap at the bottom there. But look at the top over the total period, the 90th percentile. 628 down to 623. Now notice something, these scale scores are compared to those, remember the country scores at the top? They're around 600. So our top kids are performing, just as good as the average kid in Hong Kong or Singapore or Korea or Chinese Taipei. But it's not that, every American kid's left behind or some of this stuff like that. Now, to PISA. If you want to make the case the U.S. is doing horrible internationally, use PISA data, because this is the test we really don't do very well on. The rock concert item test. So here's science. PISA, by the way, is given every 3 years in science, math, and reading, and one of the subjects, and they cycle through, is the key subject, so it dominates the test, but then they have enough items in the other 2 subjects to keep a trend line going, if that makes sense. So in 2006 it was science, in 2009 it'll be reading, and then in 2012 it'll be math again, where the United States is one of the rare countries that ability groups within classes for reading in grades like 1 and 2. So we still have bluebirds and redbirds and all that kind of thing. Very unique. By the way, U.S. scores very high on reading. 4th grade reading, I didn't bring any reading data, but the United States scores, and always has scored very well in reading at 4th grade. So whatever we're doing in reading, we should run out and throw it, chuck it. It's working pretty well, at least internationally speaking. So the U.S. does a lot more grouping before high school than other countries, and our junior highs have groups, tracks if you want to call them that, especially in mathematics. At 8th grade, you'll have several different math courses. What the other countries do then is they have a much more radical tracking system once you get to high school. They track by schools, typically. So in Japan, and think of the incentives this creates for the 13-year-old and 14-year-old. You know, in the United States, that's where scores individually start declining, is middle school and high school. And in Japan, the 13 and 14-year-olds, that's when they're working their hardest, because they declare one school that they're going to try to exam into. And they go to Juku. 2/3 of Japanese students go to Juku. Almost 80% in Korea. That's after school. They're done with their day at school. Now they go off to another school that their parents pay for. And they study for the exam. And they also go on Saturdays. So there is this intense academic immersion that happens in especially Korea and Japan. For 13, 14-year-olds, our teenagers just simply have a different life. They just did. American teens are just very, very different. And the cultural sort of differences that I've noticed, you know, like when you talk to parents. For instance, the other place where the U.S. is an outlier is teenagers working. Part-time jobs, right? Half of American teens have a part-time job during high school. The next highest country in the world is like 10% or 15%. It's actually a stigma in the Asian countries. If you work and you're in high school, it means your family needs you to work, and they'd be embarrassed. So nobody, you know. And when I talk to Asian parents, when I travel around, they say my kid has a job. It's calculus. It's studying. That's my daughter's job, not flipping hamburgers. I want them to study calculus so they won't ever have to flip hamburgers, not flip them out. So our teens just have a different life. They spend their time differently. We have 3 big activities that dominate American teens' lives. By that I mean the average American teen spends more than 15 hours a week on 3 things. One is socializing with friends, which is great. And American kids are very social. I took a group of 12 California teenagers to China in 1985. Right? And everywhere we went, I mean, the people were like, God, these American kids are so amazing. Because they are. They're very confident. They can make friends. They can walk in and shake hands with anybody. Other kids are not like that around the world. So there are trade-offs to these things. American kids stand out like a sore thumb everywhere. That's not a good phrase. They stand out for this confidence and verbal ability and friendliness and sociability. Well, they spend 15 hours a week on socializing, and they spend 15 hours a week on part-time jobs, and they spend 15 hours a week on sports and extracurricular activities. And like I said, other countries just don't do that because they're working on this, science and math. So here's PISA. Now notice the difference. The dark green are all the countries that outscore the United States to a statistically significant level. And here's the U.S. down here, 489, below average. And I've broken them apart. These are the OECD countries. These are developed nations. So this is against our real sort of economic competitors. And then over here, these are called partner nations. Some of them are developed, but most of them are not. And they're not in the OECD, so they're partner nations on the test. And the same color coding. So even among the partners, there's quite a few that are outscoring the U.S. or scoring just as well. More that are scoring below. But this is the kind of statistic you read in the newspaper and everyone's shocked. You know, like, we need to do something. Because this really does show us at the bottom. Here's a way of looking at gains now. Here's the 2003. This is just the OECD nations, and you see the U.S. is down here at 495, and then in 2006, 489, so it actually dropped. Didn't do well in 03 and did worse in 06. This is science. Here's math on PISA. Terrible. Down with Spain and Portugal. I'm a golfer, I love Spain and Portugal, but terrible test scores. And there's the non-OECD jurisdictions, and even some of them, especially again, Asian countries, outscore the United States. Now what's interesting, and again, PISA, remember that's the problem-solving, constructivist-oriented test. Finland always scores at the top of this. Finland stopped participating in Temps. They score around the middle in Temps. So they last took it in 1999. So there's some game playing going on among the nations as far as, oh, we did well on this test and not this one. So guess which one, you know, which one they want to take. The Finnish curriculum in math is very similar to PISA. It's very problem-solving oriented, very rock concert, how many kids can you get in oriented. It's one reason why they're useful. And here is a comparison of 03 and 06, US, very low in 03, and even lower again in 06. So we'll see, the 09 data should be out next December. Okay, let me sum up in terms of performance of the United States. So scores are higher on Temps and Pearls. Pearls is the reading test. I didn't bring the data, but that's another Temps test, but it's called Pearls. It's the program in international reading literacy. The top third of nations on Temps. The US scores in the top third of nations on Temps at 4th and 8th grade. So the sort of question that each of these bullets addresses is, how does the US do? We score in the bottom third of nations on PISA. Very different results on those two tests. Temps, math, and science, there are 4 or 5 Asian countries that outdistance the rest of the world. And the US is at the top to the middle of that second tier. So we're not at the bottom on Temps. And even on Temps, however, there's no reason for complacency. It would take several decades of significant gains to join the top tier of nations. In fact, I computed it once, it would take like 60 years or something. So there's a lot of room for improvement. So let me speculate. Why do the top scoring nations do so well? And I'll just label this right up front. These are my ideas. This is speculation. The first is culture. There is an academic press, and that doesn't mean academic media, press like a newspaper. There's an academic emphasis, press for academic performance, in not just in schools, but also in families, and in the society as a whole. It's just expected that kids will do well, that they will study as hard as necessary to do well. There was a wonderful study in, I'm trying to remember, Harold Stevenson and Stigler were the authors of the study. They did a study of, they watched mothers with their, these were 9-year-olds, doing math problems. They gave a math test, right? To 3 kids from 3 different countries, the United States, China, and Japan. And they had the mothers there, and they asked them a bunch of questions like, is your kid good at math? And they asked the kids, are you good at math? The American kids always score at the top on that indicator. If you ask American kids, are you good at math? They all think they're great. They're just not, can't score that way once you get the test. But very confident before you get the test. So the mothers were confident. The Asian parents were not confident at all. Now, you know, gets lazy, do his work. Then they get the test, and of course, Japanese kids were at the top. Chinese just a little hair below them. American kids way up. And they watch the mothers work with the kids too. And the American parents, if the Chinese or Japanese mother's child was struggling at school, they blamed it on the kid. And in the United States, they blamed it on the school or the teacher. Teacher doesn't understand my child, teacher isn't providing for my child. But the Japanese parents in particular were, oh, you're not doing well, you're not working hard enough. So now you have to work twice as hard. That's the solution.
If you work hard, you'll learn. The American parents were more likely to see math as an inborn trait. Like, oh, I was no good at math, his father was no good at math. That kind of thing, right? See, we never say that about reading, you know, at a cocktail party. You never hear anyone go, you know, oh, I'm illiterate. My husband's illiterate. No wonder why Johnny can't read. But in math, for some reason, it's okay to do that. I'm no good at math. My husband wasn't good at math. In Japan, they would pass out if they said that. I mean, it's just, you aren't going to say, oh, I was no good at math. So this culture, this academic press. The second thing is time, both in terms of a longer day and year, and that's not a sort of set in stone thing. I did a study of this, looking at countries that, the same thing Hanishek did with GDP and test scores. I did it with time in school, both extended day and extended calendar year, but looked at change. So I looked at countries that had increased their time or decreased their time from 1995 to 2003 on Temps, and then ran the correlations to see, did those countries show also growth in their math and science scores? And they did. They did. So longer day and year, but also that time outside of school. That's also a key difference between low scoring and high scoring. One more thing. In terms of these sort of, people will make statements about international systems, like there are some advocates of, let's say, a national test, and they say, all those countries at the top, they call them the A-plus countries, have national tests, therefore we should have national tests. The only problem with that logic is all those countries at the bottom, they also have a national test. So just be careful when you hear people arguing, you know, based on a simple correlation. You have to look at things a little more sophisticated than just, what are the top countries doing? If we do that, we'll be fine. It doesn't work that way. So the third point is curriculum. And as I mentioned earlier, they tend to have a lean, focused curriculum. The Singapore curriculum, which is Indian market here in the United States, there are districts that have adopted it. It's sequential, so it builds. You know, concept is taught, kids master it, it goes to the next concept, and it builds like that. Instead of spiraling, the U.S. curriculum tends to spiral. Teach, test, review, go back, reteach, test, review. So you keep spiraling back and repeating this stuff. That's not necessarily the most efficient way. National Math Panel recommended that we get away from doing that. It also, it sends the kids a very subtle message. You don't need to learn this because you'll have it 500 times. Just pick it up one of these times. So in 7th grade, they're learning really the same stuff they learned in 3rd grade, just reviewing. The fourth thing, and this is a big difference, the teachers in the high-scoring countries are trained in academic disciplines rather than ed schools, especially at 8th grade. And that's very important because more and more now we're getting kids taking algebra in 8th grade. If you have a teacher teaching algebra to you, that teacher better have taken higher level math, himself or herself. Now, in the high-scoring nations, something like 70-something% of the 8th grade math teachers have a math major or minor. They studied math in college. Ours did not. Most of ours took math ed. And it's less than 40% actually majored or minored in math in the 8th grade. So, and it doesn't mean you have to, you know, do linear algebra to teach algebra, but it does mean you have to have a good grasp of mathematics and have been taught it by actual masters of the discipline and not educators that are focusing on pedagogy. So that's all I have for you. And we can talk about this in any way that you'd like. Any questions?
I hope that you think these series are good and educational. I think I've learned so much better understanding of the test and how to read them next time when I read an article. I wanted you to please be sure you fill out the evaluation. it helps us have to make a decision.
Thank you, Sam. Great job. Appreciate Sam Howard's leadership at the Chamber Education issues. And also want to thank again our sponsors, the City Paper and Dell. And thank you all for coming out and being a part of this successful forum tonight. Have a good evening.
Thank you.